Hi, this is David Heine, and today we're in Nijmegen at what is called the Cannabis Castle. With us today is Alan Dronkers, who is the owner and operator of the Cannabis Museum in Amsterdam, also Sensi Seed Company, which is one of the oldest marijuana seed companies in the world. Alan, I remember in 1970 when I was first in Amsterdam that there wasn't any coffee shops or places that you could go. It was still an underground marijuana scene. It's all changed now, hasn't it? And how did that come about?
Well, there was some big research done first by the government in the beginning of the 1970s by the so-called Baan Commission. And they came to the conclusion, first of all, that cannabis products were not as harmful as other drugs. So there was a clear separation made within the Dutch law between soft and hard drugs. And it was the first step into the direction of the separation of the market. This was the next goal to do. It was clear that the health risks of cannabis products was not as great as with other drugs like heroin or as LSD in this time. And the Dutch government was seeing the drugs especially as a health hazard, as a health problem, and not so much as a problem for the Justice Department or the police to solve or deal with.
Well, it's still really not quite legal in Holland, is it? What is the real status of marijuana here in Holland?
Yes, you're right. Right now, for example, we see a lot of coffee shops where openly cannabis products are sold. This started also in the 1970s, first in youth houses where young people would hang out, and they had all kind of activities there. These were sponsored places by the government in that time, where first house dealers started to deal hashish and marijuana to young people, so they wouldn't go to other dealers that were also sell hard drugs. And in the beginning of the 1980s, the government started to cut down all kind of budget, and especially cut the subsidizations to these youth houses. So these youth houses disappeared. And after that, basically these house dealers started the first coffee shops. Well, coffee shops were easy to start in this time. And in this coffee shop, they would do basically, they have the same practice. They would have a bag with some cannabis, some hashish in there, and they would sell it to the people that knew that that's the house dealer, there I can buy something. And slowly more and more coffee shops got around in Holland, and they were tolerated, which means that they basically the sale of hashish and marijuana is completely illegal. But because everybody understood that it was better that it was sold openly and controlled, they decided to tolerate or do nothing. Toleration is basically doing nothing. First, what you see also is that these coffee shops were closed 10 times, 15 times, and then the police got tired and they decided to let it be. And that's what we call toleration. And up till now is that in the beginning of the 1990s, we see that the government comes with a lot more rulings, especially also 94, 95. There were some more rulings, 96 also. So there's a lot of rulings for these coffee shops, a lot of rules where they have to fit in and apply to. But in fact, these coffee shop owners still don't have a legal position. Let be that the cannabis is legal or the sale of it is legal. It is still all illegal. It's all illegal. The clear difference what we have is that up to 30 grams, it is seen as a misdemeanor. So if you, and as a perfect personal use amount, so they will not enact, they will not do something. But above 30 grams is still a crime, and police officially will do something about it when people have more than that amount. Of course, coffee shops do have always a higher amount of products in stock, but this is now already changed, or anyway they made some special ruling for that also, that a coffee shop should not have more than 500 grams in a shop. This is of course a crime, a criminal offense to have that in your shop. But the public ministry basically puts the priority on tracking down the sale and production of and use of hard drugs, and is not putting his attention to coffee shops. So that's why we see that the sale is still happening in Holland. Yeah.
One thing that's always perplexed me with the illegality of these coffee shops, where are they supplied from?
Well, this is the gray area. We always talk about the front door of the coffee shop and the back door of the coffee shop. So the front door of the coffee shop is regulated. It's not legalized, but regulated. Everybody knows how it's working, and there's no real illegal thing happening anymore, except that it's still illegal by law, but it's regulated. The back door of the coffee shop is still completely illegal, should have police priority still, but in practice it doesn't. And in fact, it's still a complete mess, and that's only up to the politicians that up till now didn't want to stick their neck out or get in trouble with other international countries because we were so lenient towards soft drugs here in Holland. So it's international pressure in the first place already in the 1970s that made the Dutch government decide not to legalize in that time. In that time it was the oil crisis and the pro-Israeli standpoint of the Dutch government that was already putting them in a very longsome position internationally, and they are still afraid that if the Dutch government is going to take this step towards legalization, that basically the whole world is going to fall over us. Yeah.
Well, in fact, it has created some problems in the EU with the French government, I understand.
Yeah, it did, but this is mainly in the news and in the media, and this is a little bit loud screaming in the middle of the drug war, and basically it means not that much what we see in practice on the ground floor and the level where people work with hard drug junkies and needle exchange and in practice we see that in France even there Dutch systems and Dutch ideas are copied rapidly the last few years. So even though they still make a lot of noise against drugs and they really try to heat up this war against drugs, in reality that is only the politicians on the top. The people that have to work in practice, the people that are on the street, even the police, they have a much more a better standpoint, a better overthought idea about drugs than just say something. Drugs are bad, blah blah blah, against drugs. But that's what they do. But are there any arguments? Is there any scientific basis, background for that? No, there isn't. There's in fact arguments for the Dutch system. And there's in fact arguments to finally legalize.
Earlier we were discussing prohibition. Maybe this is a good time to address that. You have a particular theory that I'm very interested in about prohibition. Maybe you'd like to explain that.
I don't know what part you're referring to the history or to the idea of prohibition itself. My idea is generally that prohibition is one of the big lies of this century. There's probably a couple of more, but this is one of them for sure. And the lie is so big that it's sometimes very difficult to see how it all fits together and how it's working. But if we look back into history, and for example, it all starts with the Opium Wars and the situation in Asia at that time, and the colonial countries like Holland and the United States and England that were dealing with opium, especially in China at that time. And one of the things they discovered was that when the Chinese government made opium illegal, suddenly something which didn't have too much value was suddenly very valuable. And something that was they were not making too much money on, they could suddenly make a lot of money on. And what I think is what happened in 1912 here in The Hague, when the first international opium laws were created, is that they decided to put the whole scheme on for the world. In that sense, that they would make opium a valuable product worldwide. And later in the next opium meetings they had in the 20s and 28, they decided to take cannabis and hashish also within these international opium laws and made of something that was basically unvaluable, had no value, hardly any value, to make it valuable and worthy all across the globe. So mafia, legal or illegal, could start to make money on something that was before it was not possible to make money on. That is what generally is my idea. So it's not so much the 1930s where big international corporations like DuPont were having a problem with fiber hemp, especially for the production of paper, for example, because they had the right to produce the patent on the process of making pulp for paper out of wood stems. This is and the pharmaceutical companies that were basically had all kind of interest where cannabis could be a natural competitor to their products. This is certainly true, but it was not the actual reason why cannabis got illegal, because cannabis got already illegal in the 1920s globally. In fact, it was added within the opium laws, and the opium laws, that's where it all started. They were intended in the first place not to protect people, because how many opium addicts were there globally? A few in China, and that's it. But simply the mechanism, money, making something that has no value very valuable, was something that is discovered, and it's in fact a historical fact that for example, our royal family, the Oranges, they were broke before the opium trade started, and in fact now it's one of the richest families in the world, and it's clear that they made their money on opium trade.
Alan, I'd like to ask you now, you have a museum, and in this museum you cover a wide variety of topics. One of the topics, of course, is the human's long association with marijuana and hashish. Could you give me a little of that history?
Oops. Yeah, well, as you say, and as you can saw already, this history is very old and goes very far back. Here in the Netherlands, there's evidence that already in the golden ages, in this time, especially farmers and poor people were using of mixtures of tobacco and hemp for smoking, especially famous painters, Teniers and Adrian Brouwer and Zorg. They made a lot of paintings with the smoking farmers, and if you look very carefully to the expression on their faces, you will also see that these people are not just smoking normal tobacco. And for example, colonies like the Dutch Indies were producing tobacco also, and especially from places like that, these mixtures of tobacco with other herbs, including cannabis, was coming from Indonesia. And there's more than one source that say that.
Not only the Dutch history, but there's a vast history in India.
Oh, yeah, enormous. And how old it really is, it's thousands of years old, that's for sure. But if we know that already, the mentioning in the Vedas and stuff, then it's, what should it be, 6,000-8,000 years old, that this connection is already there with this plant. In fact, there are some people that say that it was one of the first agricultural crops used by humanity.
So historically, we know that it was used in India, and it was one of the early crops for humans. What was the introduction of it to the West? Do we know anything about that history?
We do a little, of course. These colonial ages were bringing over information about cannabis, and cannabis was generally used in these areas as a medicine. What we also can see is that at the same time we were sort of rediscovering this plant also as a medicine. We see that especially in the centuries before us, the 2 centuries before us, cannabis was a very important medicine. It was part of most medicines that were available, and yeah, even also in Holland, we see that 16th, 17th century pots that bear the name cannabis, that come from basically herbalists that were using it within different mixtures that they were preparing for people as medicine. A very good example is William Salisbury, the private doctor of Queen Victoria, and he was also prescribing hashish for menstrual cramps in that time, menstrual pain. And he sort of rediscovered this plant also. And what you see is that slowly the medical science was very interested in this product. But within this century is that you see that a lot of materials got chemically synthesized, and slowly we moved away from all natural products, where originally all these medicine came from.
Speaking of that, we moved away from the old hemp ropes and the cloth and everything. We're kind of rediscovering that as well as medicine again, aren't we?
Yeah, exactly. You know, probably, you know, the hemp plant was in our history not so much important for its active ingredients, psychoactive ingredients, or its medicinal use. It was probably most important as a resource, especially what you say, cloth. Sailing boats couldn't go without hemp. Next, after wood, hemp was the main ingredient you needed to build a ship in this time. And you must know that every ship was carrying tons of hemp just to be a ship. And many things, discovery of the New World and many other things would never have happened without this plant. So, in fact, in our history, this is clearly our most important resource plant that we had. Nowadays, where we understand that all kind of things are going wrong with our environment, and especially there's something wrong with our resources, and that means that these resources we use nowadays are not durable, are not renewable. That's why we start to rediscover hemp as a resource, because hemp is durable and hemp is renewable and sustainable. So which means that it's if we come to the point where we start to make many of our products with hemp again, we can basically, this is right away positive effect for the environment.
Now you have a lot of different kind of people passing through that museum. Who basically comes there?
Everybody, really everybody. Really everybody. I mean, groups of the police school or a narcotic brigade from Sweden or law students or medical students or just grandmothers and fathers up to kids from 14, 15 years old. Everything walks into the museum, and that is the great part. It's not specifically there for people who have, for example, only interest in the smoking of marijuana. This is a museum about hemp, about cannabis, and it's there to teach people something. It's there to open their mind in certain ways, to broaden their perspective or their ideas about this plant. When we just met, you told me that you walked into our museum and you learned something, and that's exactly where this is about. Not only you have learned something in our museum, but in fact my goal is, and our goal is with this museum, that everybody who walks into the museum, even if he knows a lot about cannabis already, or some people who have no idea, never had any books or any information about this plant, that they walk out of the museum saying, gee, I didn't know that. Wow, I've learned something. And if there's one problem for the hemp plant, for cannabis, in this world, it is lack of knowledge, lack of information, ignorance, so to speak. And this is something that can only be changed by giving information, by teaching people about their history. Because That's all we do. It's not, we don't make up a story, you know, this is our history. We present our history, and unfortunately we cannot find this history in our school books. We cannot find this history in most other museums, because if it has something to do with hemp, it has something to do with drugs, and people are still sort of scared of that. So better not to know nothing about it, or better not to talk about it because it's something bad. And this is the wrong idea. We should learn about this. In fact, the more we learn about this, the better our ideas can get. And plus, even if something is bad or scary, if a young adult has learned about the dangers and the possibilities and whatsoever, everything that has to do with drugs, then you can be sure that this young adult will make the right choice. If his mother told him all his life, you better know nothing about it and stay away from it, but one day he doesn't stay away from it, he still knows nothing about it. And that's where the mistakes happen, and that's where things go wrong. Let us be honest, you know. I am very much against drugs, against hard drugs especially. I hate hard drugs. I just want to make very clear that cannabis can also be used as a recreational drug. But this is also a resource. This is also a resource for farmers that is around us already for thousands of years. And this is also a very, very important medicine for some very sick people in the world today. And what makes me happy is that, for example, 8-9 years ago, when I was telling journalists about this, that this was a medicine, they laughed at me. It was like, okay, Mr. Dronkers, you smoke another one, ha ha ha. But today, it's not a joke anymore. Even our Minister of Health is talking about marijuana as a medicine. Even in England or in the United States, marijuana is discussed about also as a medicine. And this is what makes me happy. Makes me happy because it's not good for me. I don't care, you know. I'm not sick. I'm not dying of AIDS, or I don't have cancer, or I don't have MS or glaucoma. You know, I'm a healthy person. But for people who are really sick, patients that before they were calling me from England like, yeah, my wife is 56 and I am 55 and I was a pilot before and my wife has MS and now I have to go to some dealer on the street to buy her some hashish and I don't know how to give it to her. And this was the reality of just 5-6 years ago, that people were calling me from all over the place for information, for help. Did I know a doctor that could help him? Did I know some patient union that could give him information or help him? In this time, I didn't know, because it was still something that most people didn't want to hear, didn't want to believe, doctors didn't want to listen or see. But now it's a completely other story. It's proving itself day by day. In fact, the patients themselves, they are proving it. I knew it already a long time. In fact, there's a difference between knowing and knowing in this case also, because I was talking already for years about medical marijuana before I met the first MS patient. And when I met the first MS patient, it was something else. It was not, I didn't only know that this was a medicine, I realized this was a medicine. And if you see somebody like this, and he can suddenly control his muscles again after smoking a joint, literally stand up out of his wheelchair, this is something that, yeah, as a person, it moves me, and it makes me only stronger to fight the ignorance, to fight the propaganda that is produced about this plant for so many years already, that are clear ignorance and lies. And I just wish that this lying of the media, let us be honest, the media has a great part in this also, about this plant will stop, and more realistic programs will honestly show people what this plant is all about.
Now, speaking of plants, we've talked a little about marijuana and we've talked about hemp. Your museum makes a third distinction, and that is hashish. What is the difference between marijuana and hashish?
Well, hashish and marijuana are basically same products. The marijuana is the dried female flower of the hemp plant, and if you look with a microscope to this flower, you will see that there's some gland, some resin on this flower. If you look with a microscope, you can see that it's all little stems with balls on top, like see-through. Transparent material, and this is the resin. Once these flowers are dried and they are made fine, and then they do that above a fine screen, then all these small balls will go to the finest screen, and these stems also, and then what you get is a very fine powder, pollen they say, and when this is pressed, then you have hashish. So there is a distinction. Hashish and marijuana are not the same, because hashish is a piece of black stuff or brown stuff, and marijuana is just a green dried flower, right? An herb. But in reality, they're the same. They come from the same material, the same active ingredient, the hashish on this flower. They're both natural product. There's no chemical process or cooking down with chemicals or whatsoever, like happens with heroin or cocaine or something. Both hashish and marijuana are natural products that you get from the dried female flower of the hemp plant.
Now, another part of your business or your enterprise here is a Cincy Seed Company. It's a very old company in the sense of modern times, dealing with types of seeds of these plants. Can you tell me a little of the origin of this company?
Well, this company started in 1984, so we exist 15 years now. What you can see is that genetics, basically people up to the 70s here in Holland, nothing much happened. The first people that started to grow cannabis plants used just pigeon food or fiber hemp stuff to grow their plants from, and the quality of this hemp wasn't too great, of course. But already in this time there were people in the United States, for example, that were collecting seeds from various places, and also the first hippies from here, like my father, went to India and all these places to discover not only hashish and marijuana, but also to bring back seeds. And in the beginning of the 80s, you see that all these seeds come together from the United States and the people here in Holland that collected them. And then the first breeding program started. So people really started to put work into breeding new hybrids with these pure strains or hybrids that were already created. And that revolutionized the quality, yes.
Part of the idea, as near as I can tell, is to make distinguishing characteristics of these various plants. How do you go about doing that?
It's a bit tricky. You are always looking for specific characteristics of a plant. You talk about breeding, I guess, and if you breed, you know also that people here in Holland they have to grow the plant outdoor, which means that it should at least finish at a certain time, or they grow it indoor or in a greenhouse, and then people want to have compact flowers with a nice odor, and they should not take half a century to finish. So basically people want plants that produce a lot of flowers in a short time period with a high quality. If you would only look at those characteristics, your choice would be limited already pretty quickly to mainly indicas, and that is not what is really that interesting. Especially hybrids made with indicas and sativas, for example, produce more fruity smelling plants, and also the effects, for example, of high are much more related to sativas than the indica, more low stoned on the body effect. So these kind of things are, for example, things people found out already pretty quick, and these characteristics, for example, odor, is something that for Sensi Seed Bank is also very important. That if you find, for example, a parent that doesn't have the right smell, it stops there. You cannot continue in this direction. So that's with breeding. It's like a Mendel's job. People are basically using these characteristics and selecting on these characteristics, sometimes back-crossing on certain characteristics. But it is not that we have some laboratory where there's genetic manipulation done or something like that. No, it's simply a very simple Mendel's job which is done.
You also, I've noticed in your catalog, which is printed in many languages, which is very helpful. I'm sure there's somebody from every country that wants to know how.
Yeah, a lot of people want to have this information, so we were basically forced to do that. I think we are more famous outside of Holland than inside Holland. Yeah.
But you also offer various kinds of technological advances or technological supplements to growing these things indoors, don't you?
Well, that's what generally people act like. You know, they blow this up like, ooh, they made special light, ooh, equipment and professional. But all this really is that existing agricultural equipment was used within some new ideas. For indoor growing operations, for example. So there hasn't been changed that much or revolutionized that much in that field. It is just that here in Holland we were able to use all this technology which was already there, hydroponics, light systems and so on, for our own specific crop. But in the end, it doesn't really matter if you're growing hemp or tomatoes with this equipment. Yeah.
And let me ask you something about the legality of growing it. Can every citizen in Holland grow a plant or two?
No, in fact, it's illegal to grow marijuana. It's always illegal to grow marijuana. Already one plant is illegal. They tolerate up to 4 plants, they say, but it's still illegal. What is legal is like if I want to grow seeds or if I want to grow fiber or wood, yeah, then it's legal to grow hemp plants. But if I want to grow marijuana, it's always illegal to grow hemp plants. Even the so-called low THC, EC registered hemp strains, yeah, you are not allowed to make marijuana of these plants.